So today it's a great pleasure to have Johan van Overtveldt here as my guest. He's the former finance minister of Belgium. He's also a long-time journalist, has been editor-in-chief of Belgian magazines Trends and Knak. He's a public intellectual, both in Belgium and I would say in the international, on the international level. I think you have known Milton Friedman personally,
yes,
if I'm not mistaken. Johan has written many books on monetary policy topics and economics in general, and today he will be presenting his new book here, the Icarus Curse. So I think there may be a small connection issue there, but so yeah. We'll also film this for Riks Europe, the YouTube channel. Welcome, Johan, and I give the word to you.
Thank you for the, as always, too friendly or too much flowers introduction. Let me start with an anecdote now that you mentioned it on Milton Friedman. He died in December 2006. I visited him the last time in San Francisco, his apartment on top of Taylor Street with a fantastic view on the bay, in July of 2006. And when we parted, I was not thinking about the fact that it would have been the last time that I saw him. He said, "Before you go, read this." And he gave me two or three pages like this. I started to read it. Again, July 2006. And what he gave me was a description of the financial crisis of 2008. The subprimes. I must say that at that time, again, the summer of 2000, I hadn't even heard about subprimes. So he described the crisis there. He said, "Oh, it's interesting." I thought, he's getting old. Who predicted in the summer of 2006 the financial crisis? But that was Friedman. He had it all sorted out. And of course, I've cursed myself many times, having not asked for a copy of what he had written until then. But unfortunately, I didn't do it because honestly, I thought it was a little bit crazy. In 2006, talking about a huge financial crisis, which he did in that text. But that I'll come back to that later. But that is certainly one of the. I've met a lot of people who were very interesting, but people who really made a huge impression on me. There are a few, and Milton Friedman was certainly among them. Like also Paul Volcker, for example, the Fed chairman, and Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. That's my trio. Unfortunately, all three of them are gone, which says something about my age too. Now, the book. As those of you who write certainly have experienced too, often the seeds of a new book are already to be found in your former book. And as in 22, I published The Mystic Hand, a book on central banking that basically dealt with the characteristics and the consequences, and especially the unintended consequences of what central banks had been doing up to that time in the 21st century, starting a little bit earlier, but basically in the 21st century. Meaning very low, even sometimes negative interest rates, and then, of course, the whole quantitative easing story. Of those unintended consequences, one of the consequences that I found very striking and that I experienced myself having been in government for 4.5 years, is the way in which those central bank policies liberated politicians. We all remember central bankers saying we will do whatever it takes and we can do even more. And I can assure everybody here that did not fall into deaf ears in the political world. So whenever there was pressure to do something, there was always at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of my colleagues who said, well, Johan, don't worry, central banks, Draghi will take care of it. We don't have to do too drastic things. Now, while finishing the mystic hand, I felt a certain frustration with only having stumbled upon that unintended consequences of central bank policy, especially against the background of what I would like to define as the rising discontent in large parts of the population, increasingly large parts of the population. So I started to think about where does the discontent come from? Of course, when you then look at the 21st century, it's hard to deny that we had what Nassim Taleb defined as black swans. Oops. But of course, we had really black swans, events that are quite unusual or rare, like a black swan. But when they happen, they usually have a huge impact. Actually, as some of you probably know, black swans do exist in, I think, somewhere in Australia or something, or New Zealand. 9/11 was, of course, a major disruptor on all fronts. A maybe even bigger disruptor was this one. Some of you might recognize the Lehman Brothers building in New York, with a seemingly still happy guy running out of the building, but probably that would not have lasted for long. The pandemic was, of course, also a major shock. And, of course, the war in Ukraine also was a major shock. And to make the list complete, obviously the inflation outburst also was a major shock in most of the Western democracies. By the way, it is now clear, I think, that inflation played an important role in the victory of Donald Trump in the United States, to the disadvantage of Biden and Harris. So, but if you look at these events and try to relate them to the rising discontent among larger and larger parts of the population in most Western democracies, look at the latest polls in Germany for the election in a few days, then I felt quite unsatisfied with only these major events as explanation, because, for example, 9/11 was a huge event, but after that we still had attacks, but of course not of the magnitude that we saw on that occasion. With respect to COVID, for example, I think we all, if we are honest with ourselves, that we were all much surprised that we got those vaccines so quickly after the pandemic started. With respect to Ukraine, of course, we have now the present-day discussion with Mr. Trump, but until now, the Western Front held relatively well vis-à-vis Mr. Putin, whatever you think of the... So, and the inflation, at the end of the day, it was, of course, a serious outburst, but we contained it quite quickly. Inflation came down quite rapidly also. So, try to use these 5 events as an explanation for the great discontent that is apparently present in Western democracies is not really satisfactory. I finally ended up thinking about this in the depression of the 30s. Whoops. Okay, I'm really not made for this kind of stuff. The Great Depression, a financial and economic and social crisis never seen again since then. In the United States and Germany, unemployment rates went up to almost 50% of the labor force, which is of course something that we never experienced since then. Now, until the Great Depression, there was overall, in terms of economic thinking and what politicians and economists were writing and describing and doing, a kind of benign neglect vis-à-vis the economy. The economy takes care of its own, government has to stay out, and the market forces will take care of economic growth and all the other stuff. Now, that of course was clearly not happening in the 30s, when there was a kind of cumulative fall in aggregate demand that led to a vicious spiral downwards, destroying large part of the economy. And of course, it was the, I hope I do this right now. Oh, you've taken over, that's a good thing. There was this guy, of course, you all know him, Mr. Keynes, who realized that that benign neglect approach was, of course, not appropriate in a depression. Let me say, for all clarity, that Keynes was certainly not alone, and that he was not even the first to talk in this way about the Great Depression and what to do about it. Lachlan Curry at Harvard University and Jacob Viner at the University of Chicago were people who were years before Keynes advocating that kind of Keynesian policies for which Keynes became famous. But that's, of course, that's what happens in intellectual history, that the ones who deserve the flowers or the cake don't get them always. But Curry and Viner were certainly prior to Keynes in advancing this argument. It was up to the authorities. So the argument of Curry, Viner and Keynes went to intervene, to step forward, to stop the fall in aggregate demand and to restore confidence of investors, entrepreneurs and consumers. And when that was then done and the economy picked up again, then of course the government could retreat. Now, during the war years and immediately after the war, something quite spectacular, if you look back on it now, happened. Because what was clearly a prescription for an economy in a depression was translated by the followers of John Maynard Keynes into a kind of handbook for the daily management of the economy. If we adjust aggregate demand all the time, a little bit less, a little bit more, depending on what's happening to unemployment and inflation, we can keep the economy almost invariably on an economic growth track and have a huge increase in welfare and well-being. One of the first to say that he totally didn't believe that this was possible was Mr. Keynes himself. There is almost a legendary story of a conference in Washington where during or towards the end of the conference, it was at the end of 1944, where he stood up and said, "Oh my God, I am the only non-Keynesian in the room here." And a few months later, there is, which is also on record, I mean, you can even find it on the internet, a speech at the Bank of England where he said the same thing, that he absolutely didn't believe in that kind of what he called hydraulic management of the economy. He didn't believe that would be possible. The disadvantages would be huge. And as a matter of fact, during that speech at the Bank of England, which happened 3 or 4 months before he died, all of a sudden in 1945, he had a huge praise for the system of this man, Mr. Adam Smith, that he still thought that was the basics of, or should be the basics of economics, economic organization, and economic policy. But the genie was out of the bottle. What happened was, first of all, that from the economics profession, Milton Friedman, Edmund Phelps, Friedrich Hayek, Bob Lucas, they already at the end of the 60s into the 70s also said this will not work, this cannot work, that kind of simple Keynesianism, whenever you see something happening to aggregate demand, you just turn on the buttons a little bit and everything will be fine. they showed clearly that that was also on the basis of economic theory and economic evidence was not what was happening. But the political world judged that differently. You must imagine how that must have impressed politicians, that on the basis of this Keynesian argument, they were liberated from financial constraints. Deficits were perfectly defendable. An increase in debt was nothing to worry about, because at the end of the day, or at the end of the cycle, the economy would pick up and debt would go down again. But this kind of freedom, of course, entered the purely political world, which is, I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, a very competitive world, where if your competitor promises X, you tend to increase X plus 1. And the next competitor will promise X plus 2. And so the Keynesian dynamic, or what, no, let me rephrase that, the Keynesian argument unleashed a political dynamic that led to, again and again, deficits and mounting debts. I can tell from my own experience in the Belgian government that whenever we were, or I, with a few support of others, was arguing for reduced spending, or at least restrained spending, there was certainly at least as many colleagues, if not more, arguing that of either no, because the economy is going up now, if we reduce spending, we might endanger the recovery. Or the economy was going down, and then of course the argument was, oh, you're gonna make the recession much worse by reducing spending. So basically there was never an argument for reduced spending or for more orthodox budgetary policies. Now, this trajectory of what I label as political misuse of the by the way, of course, the title, the Icarus Curse, comes from the fact that, you all know the mythological story of Icarus, banned to an island, feathers glued to his back, flying too close to the sun despite the warnings of his father. Everything started to melt and he crashed. Politicians started to have the same kind of confidence as Icarus, because apparently it worked. Every time they had a problem, they threw money at it. Basically, not all the time, and there are always exceptions, but the broad story was like that. And so they were increasingly confident. David Runciman, the British political scientist, talks about the confidence trap in democracies, that you're so confident that at the end of the day it always works out, that you become almost ignorant of, for example, financial and budgetary constraints. Now, this misuse did not go in one straight line. I mean, the misuse by the political world of the Keynesian heritage, because it ran into the wall a first time during the 70s with the inflation, which was, of course, ignited by the OPEC oil price rises, but of course could only expand to a structural inflation due to the fact that aggregate demand was constantly larger than aggregate supply. And then you get inflation if aggregate demand is pushing all the time against the supply constraints of the economy, then prices start to rise. And I remember vividly, and some of you might also remember, I'm looking amongst others at Budgetary, that as the 70s progressed, there was a kind of acceptance of inflation. It's like that. We have to live with it. 20% of inflation. Nothing to do about it. Arthur Burns, at that time chairman of the Federal Reserve, gave a famous speech, a kind of acceptance of inflation speech in, if I remember correctly, 76. There was one man, actually I remember vividly that period, there was one man who did not agree with that kind of attitude. Oh, sorry, I have to go back. I come back to this later. Let me first, and that's Paul Volcker, who at the end of the 70s said, yes, we can We can fight inflation. But we're going to do it otherwise. We're not going to do what central banks have been doing and are also doing now by incrementally changing policy rates. What he said was, interest rates will be whatever they will be. We're going to restrain the money supply, which meant in practice bank reserves. And he did that from Thursday on Friday or Wednesday on Thursday, literally from one day to the other. Interest rates shot up like crazy. At one point in time, short-term interest rates in the United States were more than 100%. Not for a long time, but for a few days. Huge trouble. Everybody was shouting and screaming. To his big credit, Ronald Reagan reconfirmed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Fed, and Volcker persisted. By the way, he was in all dimensions an impressive man. I'm myself not of the smallest guys, as you may have noticed, but I remember going for an interview with him in his New York apartment, and I was not aware of what I'm going to tell you next. So I rang. Come up, 16th floor or something. He opened the door. And I was literally like, oh my God, 2 meters 8 or something, shoulders like that. The whole door opening was filled. Hello, I'm a journalist from Belgium. Very impressive guy, very humble guy, smoking cigars all the time. But he did it. He lasted as Fed chairman until '87, but
he was appointed by Carter.
Yeah. And reconfirmed by Reagan.
Carter, who was desperate, had tried everything, and then resorted to this guy who said, I want to be appointed by you, but you will have to allow me to do whatever I want to do.
Yes. And Reagan said to him, I don't know much about economics, but I think you're doing the right thing, so I will reconfirm you. Which is quite positive or quite...
if only they were also honest.
But from that followed something hugely important, and that is the trust and the almost creditworthiness that central bankers earned. The Volcker shock gave a credibility to central bankers that was huge. In that sense, that the 2% inflation target that practically all central bankers implicitly or explicitly put forward as their target was internalized by the economic and financial sector because of the trustworthiness, the creditworthiness that central bankers earned through the Volcker shock. These guys mean business. If they say they want 2% inflation, they will take care of 2% inflation. That has been enormously important, in my judgment, to understand what happened in the 90s and in the 21st century. But then again, like the famous Dutch football player Johan Cruyff, you all know Johan Cruyff? I have an ongoing discussion with my brother, who's the best football player ever. I say Cruyff, he says Maradona, so we no longer talk to each other. Cruyff says, one of the famous expressions of Cruyff is, I'll first say it in Dutch, elk voordeel heeft zijn nadeel. Each advantage has its disadvantage. And or is it the reverse? Well, whatever. The disadvantage of that huge creditworthiness trust central bankers earned themselves through the Volcker shock was that it was again something politicians could hide behind. Because central bankers' credibility made that the inflationary expectations of citizens, of investors, of companies was based on the firm belief that whatever happens, central bankers will always bring inflation back to 2%. And that has, again, augmented the degrees of freedom of the political world to keep on behaving like Icarus. And the question now, of course, is, and I'll stop there because I assume, like you said, that there will probably be some discussion. As we hit the wall now, as we reach the end of this cycle, where due to the rising debt, to the kind of eternal budget deficits, to the fact that central banks have not exhausted the possibilities to keep on doing what they have been doing, but are more and more recognizing that the unintended consequences of those policies are huge. Let me stop with an anecdote from my period as minister, where Benoît Cœuré was the number 2 of the European Central Bank when the European Central Bank started with quantitative easing. And I remember during that period that during a coffee break during the Eurogroup, I asked Cœuré, what is according to you, Benoît, the limit of this kind of policy, quantitative easing? And Benoît Cœuré, who was a very intelligent guy, whom I respect a lot, he was like that. And after a few seconds he said, well, when the entire euro economy is on the balance sheet of the ECB, then we have reached the limit of this policy. And technically he's right. As long as there are assets in your economy, look at Japan, that the central bank can acquire, quantitative easing can go on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. The Bank of Japan has bought equities, has bought buildings. As long as you can create money on the basis of of acquiring an asset, you're in business. I don't think we should go that way, to say the least. But the question, and I don't have the straightforward answer for that, are we hitting the limit of this kind of policies, and are we in for some fundamental readjustments? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
By the way, just to make sure that you know this guy is around too.
So thank you, Johan. It's very interesting. And indeed, if you look at history, at least, as I think Voltaire, he said that the value of paper money always goes to zero. Maybe this time it will be different, of course. I hope nobody so believes that. But there's been many episodes in history. Goethe, he wrote his play Faust about the devil trying to convince a local German monarch to accept paper money. And Goethe himself was an advisor to one of these monarchs, and that's the 1700s, right? Anyway, I think often the Icarus Curse, it ends like in the legend of Icarus, I guess. But maybe there's somebody who thinks it will be different this time around, and the wisdom of central bankers will prevent this crash. Or any other remarks, please speak up.
I just have a question, if you don't mind. Well, first of all, what you were saying about Japan, I work for a large Japanese conglomerate, and I fully recognise the validity of what you're saying there, and indeed it's probably not a solution for Europe. But my question is, the name of your book is the Icarus Curse, but one person who I think isn't, or like Icarus, or perhaps plays an anti-Icarus role, is President Milei of Argentina. I was wondering if you'd be able to share perhaps your thoughts on President Milei, what he's doing, and perhaps lessons we can learn in Europe. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a very interesting question, which is the first phrase of that you give as an answer when you have to think about it. But I mean, every day that goes by now makes clear that there is something really happening there in Argentina. Let's not forget that a century ago, Argentina was among the richest countries in the world. And if you want to look at how a structural decline in terms of well-being and welfare happens, then you have to look at Argentina. It's going down the drain all the time since then. So what he is doing in terms of deregulation, especially deregulation of cutting back public expenditure, cutting back on bureaucracy, is really impressive. I think most of us, I at least did so, thought that this would end in huge social unrest and demonstrations, revolutions, whatever. Apparently, hardly anything is happening. Probably because the Argentine people felt that really they were at the end of the line. It couldn't get any worse, so let's this guy have his try at it. I'm not really a specialist on Argentina, but I'm wondering, I think together with a lot of people here, or I'm surprised that, first of all, that he has been able to do what he has done until now, and secondly, that there is hardly any protest against what he is doing. And that even now, the IMF becomes quite positive, which of course is maybe a bad sign, I don't know. But it's certainly something to look closer at, also for Japan. And certainly for Europe, maybe to some extent also the United States, but that's of course a different story. Yes.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation and for presentation.
I don't think they can hear you.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to touch upon the last words you said about unintended consequences of what we are doing in Europe, new generation, and all the news about new debts that we all talk about. We need it, and the solution is a new debt, but nobody talks about these unintended consequences. Can you perhaps think where do you see these consequences for the economy?
Well, of course, obviously, in the European context, the level of the European level is the next level in terms of debt accumulation. We have filled the national coffers, not all countries, but quite substantial part of the European Union. France, Italy, Belgium, Spain are all countries that in terms of the national debt are hitting at least some limits. And it's, of course, not a coincidence that exactly these countries are pleading for euro bonds and euro level debt. Of course, if you have a sound economic structure, at one point accumulating debt does not have to be a problem. But the issue is that you need to have an underlying economic structure that produces economic growth. Because I hear the arguments of the degrowth people. I find that a little bit crazy, but you need economic growth. If you have sufficient economic growth, debt, within limits, remains manageable. If you don't do what is necessary to have that growth, which is minimal in Europe, the economic growth is not fantastic already for some time, and all the projections that I see remain in the 0 to 1% growth area. Then, of course, debt is an issue. No growth, debt becomes a problem. So it depends. If together with European debt we succeed in creating an environment that is much more stimulative for economic growth, then I would tend to go along. But if we don't do these reforms, the capital markets union, taxation reforms at the level of national states, then accumulating debt at the European level is just one more stage towards the moment when, as the Americans say, the shit hits the fan, which can happen in many different ways. Yes.
Could you elaborate a bit more about how capital market union, what will be the impact on growth, and especially what will be the impact on productivity, which has been going down, especially in Western countries? Like, can you elaborate a bit also which sectors do you think will be mostly stimulated from this?
Let me start by an anecdote. In 2017, as a Minister of Finance, I was visiting New York for some kind of official happening. I don't remember exactly what it was, but there was half a day that there was nothing for me on the agenda. And I asked my people to look for Belgian entrepreneurs who had moved to New York recently. And they found almost immediately 7-8 addresses, Brooklyn, Queens, all over the place. And we visited them. And of course, the first question when you do that kind of trip is, why did you come to New York? Entrepreneurs from Ghent, from Antwerp, from Louvain-la-Neuve, most of them in the tech sectors. Mm-hmm. And naively, at that time, I was thinking about the American market, the uniform market, the technology base, which is of course very much there in and around New York. No, all of them, not one exception, all of them told me that they went to New York for funding. All of them. Mm. And all of them had the same story. Mr. Minister, it's very easy in Europe, in Belgium, to find a few €100,000 to start a business. You start, you fall, you stand up again, you fall again, you stand up again, and after 1 or 2 years, you finally know what you really want to do and how you have to do it. And then you come up with a business plan for which you need 3 or 4 million euros, and then doors close. And there was one guy, if I remember correctly, he was from Louvain-la-Neuve. What he was doing was the following. When I was there, Adele, the singer, was doing a performance in Antwerp. And he was selling tickets. But the tickets that companies had bought to send their customers to that performance, and they realized a few days before the performance, my God, we still have 50 tickets here, what are we going to do with it? So he assembled those tickets worldwide, not only from performances of Adele, but football in Australia, basketball in the United States, performance of the Rolling Stones in Croatia, and he redistributed them, and he had 25, 30 people working for him. On the phone, on the PC, they were all sitting in a room. And he, let's say that I was with him on a Wednesday. On a Monday, he had pitched for $3 or $4 million through a broker. And while we were there on Wednesday, I mean, it was 2 days difference, that's the important point, he got a phone call from his broker that the money was there. And I asked for what his file. It was something like 3 or 4 pages like this, with a balance sheet. I thought, oh my God, I keep my wallet close at hand here, but this is worth nothing. And he got 3-4 million. Within 48 hours, if you do that in Belgium or even in France or Germany, you need months.
And what is the reason for that? Is it because they have private equity or hedge funds?
Because they have investment funds who talk about billions like we talk about a million. Mm. And so they have their... I talk to guys at BlackRock, for example. Mm-hmm. They have their models. It's like a Gauss curve. And they know they do 100 initiatives, 50 or 60 money lost. Mm. They know. 30 are getting the money back or a little bit more, and then there are on 100 cases there are 3 or 4 or 5 where they do their initial input times 1,000 or 5,000. That's the model. So they don't care. Mm. They know that if they give somebody 3 or 4 million, that the chance that this guy fucks up, sorry for the expression, is larger than that he succeeds. Mm. But you can only take that attitude if you have investment funds of 10 or 20 or 50 billion. Mm. which we hardly have here, certainly in Belgium, but also in Europe.
And is that because of the capital restrictions between European countries?
I can assure you, it's my second term in the European Parliament. I've been in several discussions on capital markets union. And then, for example, what companies have to put on the table when they do an IPO. It's totally different if you compare Denmark with Spain. And then you say, okay, we can try to find a kind of optimum or uniform approach. And then you propose something, and then everybody says, oh, yes, yes. But there's one thing missing. Check. And the guy from Portugal says, yeah, but there's another thing missing. Check. And after 2 hours discussion, you're looking at something that is completely incoherent, that is very complicated due to all the things that are added and then retreated and added to things that were added before. And that's what makes European decision making all the time so complicated. And certainly if you talk about capital markets, there are always countries who think that whatever they have as an ongoing system for whatever you can imagine, for example IPOs, who are not prepared to give up their magnificent system for European companies. That's the problem.
All right, thanks. Yes, Tim.
Thank you very much. It's very enlightening what you say. I have two more practical questions also because of your role in the European Parliament. One would be regarding the next long-term budget. Will there be more debt financing or not? I mean, we have to repay already the current NGEU debt. We have now more probably demand for defense. We have to finance Ukraine. We have to finance enlargement and probably a few other things. The green transition will continue, whatever, the digital transition. I mean, the ideas you see are numerous and all are probably with with hundreds of billions, which you could invest in them. Where do you see the prospects of having more European debt? And secondly, also when it comes to regulation, we talked about the value of deregulation and the good examples of Millet. The last 5 years, I think there's never been such a tsunami of new regulation connected with the Green Deal, but also beyond. Supply chain, sustainable management of supply chains. It's an incredible amount just of regulation. And now we do a little bit of omnibus here and there, which will certainly be not enough. What's your prediction? Will it be possible in the next 5 years to also reduce that regulation or not really? So those two things, I'd be interested in your crystal ball.
Just to be clear, you were asking about what I expect to happen. You are not asking what I think it should happen.
Okay, maybe, but more your expectations, but what you would suggest would also be interesting.
Well, first of all, if we can believe Ms. von der Leyen, when she introduced her new program, we should have indeed a tsunami of simplification. Now, Mr. Séjourné, the commissioner who is responsible for this stuff, on two occasions in the last week or 10 days said that of course we are thinking about throwing out regulation, which was quite remarkable to hear him as a Frenchman talking like that.
Especially because he voted for almost all of these things himself as an MEP.
Of course. So I'm relatively optimistic that some things will move. But I don't think that what von der Leyen promised 35% reduction in administrative burden will happen. I cannot imagine that she can do that. If we could get real limitations on reporting obligations, that would already be a huge step forward, because I'm constantly meeting Flemish medium and small entrepreneurs who are telling me this is impossible. They ask us to report on things I don't know anything about. I have to hire people to do this for me, and if you hire people, that costs you money, as we all know. So this is really this is sometimes embarrassing if you have to have these discussions with down-to-earth people who try to get their business going from day to day. This is sometimes really embarrassing. I'm not ashamed to say that. So will we go far enough? I don't think so. Will we go some way in curing the craziness of the past term, thanks to essentially Mr. Timmermans, whose heritage is flabbergasting? Yes, I think we will do it. But you had another question?
European debt.
Yeah, European debt. Well, it's not surprising, of course, that the countries with already huge debt are those pushing most for European level debt. And like I said earlier, if together with that you can do the necessary reforms so that the chances for economic growth are also improving, then there's a lot to be said for that, especially with this huge pressure on defense, which of course will demand billions and billions of euros for years and years to come. My expectation is that defense spending will be thrown out of the budgets in the Commission's evaluation of budgets, that they will leave defense out of it. There's something to say for that, but the question also is, what kind of defense spending are we talking about? If we are just spending money, then it will of course be largely to the benefit of the huge American companies who are producing all the military stuff. I think it would be very wise to have a lot of the money oriented towards stimulus for building up military industrial capacity, which to a certain extent is of course also the responsibility of the individual member states. You can easily create a huge tax advantage for those who invest in military industrial infrastructure, cyber, dual use. There are a lot of possibilities there to create opportunities. But again, also a little bit a lesson of my book, take care of where you spend your money on. Just spending can give you, like a drug, some happy feeling for some time, but the wake up is usually not so pleasant as the time you spent under influence of the drug. But that there will be. Today we have a 190 billion annual European budget. Hardly 10 billion of that budget go to defense. So maybe we should also be courageous enough to discuss on what we spent the 180 other billion, which then means cohesion policy and agricultural support policy. So my guess is that we will not discuss that. We will say that we will discuss it, but we will not change it. Unfortunately.
Afraid so.
And NGU debt there, I think it's quite clear that debt will be rolled over. We will not repay it.
So they'll take out a new loan to pay back the old loan, taking over the good practice of the member states.
Yeah.
Don't try this at home. So we have...
Or make sure then that you can blackmail your banker.
We have time for maybe 2-3 more questions before we go to the roundtable. So, Federico, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about the future, how you see the future of competition policy at the European level. Because, I mean, you discussed a bit, it seems to me that the European economic constitution has 3 pillars. Monetary policy, which used to be very monetarist in inspiration. Let's not forget when Otmar Easing was at the European Central Bank before the crisis, and then he shifted in the direction of quantitative easing. Fiscal policy, which used to be rather strict, well, rather lax stability and growth back before the crisis, but then a rather strict one for the first years afterwards, and now again a shady stability and growth pact with elements of debt, European debt that soften its amount. But competition policy is also the other pillar that is increasingly undermined, I think. We went from an order-liberal, competition policy, and now there is this competitiveness agenda, which has a simplification dimension, like you said, but it also has this European champions dimension, which essentially means undermining competition policy to promote. So I wonder if you could discuss that other dimension as well.
Yeah. Well, I think you're already given part of the answer by the way in which you describe what is happening currently. I think competition policy basically is about how do you deal with, on the one hand, protecting innovators and inventors, patents and things like that, and how you do that protection in a way that it does not become something that inhibits further innovation. And that's something we see at the moment in the United States, where the spending of the big companies, we all know them, Apple, Google, you name them, is more and more, there is some very interesting research on that issue, is more and more going in the direction of spending to protect the market. Or, let me rephrase that, spending to protect the position that the company has. Mm-hmm. And the trade-off between, on the one hand, protecting innovators for some time, to some extent, but that's Boudewijn has been doing work on that too. It's a very delicate trade-off. What we will, I fear, see in Europe under influence of especially the French. I don't know whether there are French people among the audience, but they are, of course, the specialists of this kind of argument, that we will see les champions nationaux being ready before the huge meal that is served, and then starting to eat and make sure that others don't get too close to the food. So I think Vestager did a very good job as competition policy. I don't trust Ms. Ribera, and I really don't trust her. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's how you deal with that trade-off. And I think the prospects of economic growth in Europe, in the United States, might be a little bit less optimistic than we generally think now, because of that. The impact of these 5-6 guys who are spending next year more than 300 billion euros on artificial intelligence, 5 companies, 300 billion, sorry, 300 billion. Where's the room for the smaller guys? Do they still have room, or are they killed? There is a famous paper by Chicago economists, Raghuram Rajan and a few others, the kill zone. You can look that up, the kill zone. When and how do companies like Google and Amazon and kill the smaller potential competitors? Bring in kill zone and you will find the paper most interesting. Most interesting. It's a paper. It's a paper. I told Rajan that he should write a book about it, but he is writing 3 other books, so he doesn't have the time.
All right. I think maybe was there one more question, Benny? And then
I had one that was about this Belgian example that went to New York. I don't say that what you say about the common capital market is not correct, but I think that we as Europeans sometimes miss the point why there is such an accumulation of capital in the US and there is not in Europe, and I think it's the pension systems.
Yes, of course.
And I think that all in all, I just want to say we should focus more on the pension systems and how we organize it in Europe. I think that is a very key underlying issue also for the differences between the US and the EU.
I agree. I can only say that I agree that the whole pension system and the way in which this is managed and financed plays an important role in this whole concept of getting to capital markets that are much more conducive to innovation and company building. Endowments of universities play a huge role in the United States.
All right. Well, I think we can maybe leave it here then. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.